Добро пожаловать. Добро пожаловать.
Добро paz. Hello, and welcome back to the Northwest Man. Or said another way to some of you in your native tongue, Dobro pajalovic. So many of you, I believe, majority of the people who are actually subscribing probably understood that. I hope you didn't, though, because that means you're a real person. And if you don't understand what I'm talking about, you can go back and look at some of my earlier videos, because I have a strong suspicion that most of you are just Russian bots. It's been a minute. Man, has my life been up and down for the last year and a half. And I'm sorry, things got really weird for a while with work, my day job that affords all this, terrible audio equipment and the budget video camera I have. My personal life, albeit my immediate family, meaning, the Mrs. Northwest Man, my dogs and I, we're good. But the extended family had some events that took some banding together of the larger Northwest Man family to sort of combat. A couple of you reached out to me over the last 6 months, reached out and asked me when I'm going to do another video. And that sort of touched my heart. It was nice to hear that. And so that was, believe it or not, some motivation for me to come back and do this again. And it was a matter of just sort of figuring out what the first project was going to be. I'm kind of excited about this one, though. I think you're going to like it. This is my chessboard. That sounded like Doug DeMuro. I've been watching a lot of Doug DeMuro lately. I built this 25 years ago with my father. And this is a project that my dad suggested we build together because, neither of us really play chess, but chessboards are super cool. And I think that it's a fun project for a new aspiring woodworker to take on at some point when you sort of get a few skills under your belt. And so we kind of came up with this. And at the time, if I'm being truthful, my father wasn't all that great a woodworker either. But I didn't even know how to use the machines. So what it became was we would work on a design together. I'd go out there, he'd show me how to use the machines, the bandsaw, the table saw, joiner, all that stuff. Basically give me a fear in his eyes lesson about how not to maim myself as a 19-year-old, because that's a long life to have without, a finger or thumb, especially the thumbs. The opposable thumbs are really important. There's all kinds of mistakes in here, and there's all sorts of things I look at now and I say, oh my God, why did I do it that way? That was just dumb. I look at some of the gaps in some of the gluing, and I look at some of the joints and the rounded over edges that should be, square and sharp, and it sort of makes me smile because I know that I didn't know what I was doing at the time. This thing is maple and black walnut. It's a pretty classic pairing. You usually want some pretty high contrasting wood species. Maple and walnut will do that for you. Walnut, at the time, I didn't know how expensive it was. So I think it was probably a pretty important project for him. And that's really kind of special also, is that he probably used the most expensive, nicest wood he had in his shop for his son, who had no idea what he was doing and was probably going to make a lot of mistakes and ruin a bunch of wood. And while I don't remember ruining a lot of wood, I'm sure that I did. Essentially, all you have is a frame on top, like a picture frame, a frame on the bottom, and then you have two sides. So these two sides here are just boards that hold the two frames together. And then you have drawers on both sides that slide, not even on rails. It's just, well, I guess if you wanted to call the bottom rail a rail, you could, but there's no like side drawer rails or hardwood rails in there. Some magnets actually make these kind of pop back in. That's nice. And then you have the top. The top is just a chessboard you make on the side. In this case, it is placed inside of the top frame like a picture. The frame is dadoed out, so there's a slot in there for this to sit, kind of like a box top. Essentially, this is a captive top that you would use in like a box. And that's it, man. We did we didn't have a router table. I don't remember using a router, to be honest with you. So I do remember using a lot of hand planes, though, really not very sharp hand planes that were a pain. And I remember thinking I hate hand tools because of that. These corners are so rounded over. Man, what was I thinking? Why do you let me do that? He probably came home one day and was like, what did you do to the beautiful bevels that we made yesterday? Why'd you sand them all over? And I said, because it's smooth, Dad. And he said, boy, okay, whatever, son. Yeah, so in sum, this is the first project I ever made. And it was built with my father. It was the first project I made with my father. And sadly, he's no longer with us. So the life events I told you about earlier. In memory of that, we are going to rebuild this with the skills and knowledge I have now for a friend. We're going to make something similar to this, but the joinery is going to be better. We're going to do a little bit more intricate miter joints here with some splines. We're going to use a different method to make the top because this top is, well, there are some squares, but for the most part, they are not squares because I cut each of these squares by hand, one by one, and then I put them all together, which is the dumbest way one can make a chessboard. We're also going to add some much needed depth and dimension and visual interest to this chessboard, because right now it is a kind of one note box. It's walnut on walnut on walnut. There's no, you can see the sides here. There's no like depth at all. It's just a board, a straight board. And then even the door fronts, it's just a straight board with a ready-made knob there that I think we bought. I'm sure we bought it because we weren't blacksmiths. We're gonna add some more depth of field. We're gonna have more contrast in the actual box cabinet part, and we're gonna have a much better top. I haven't decided what woods I want to use yet, although I'm sure I'll probably go back to the black walnut just because it's sort of sentimental. The maple I can take or leave because it's sort of just the yin to the walnut's yang. So maybe I'll try to find something else for that. But that's the plan, and we're gonna go get started right now. Okay, so I wanted to take just a little bit of time out to sort of recap on what we've done and what the next set of steps are going to be. A couple of steps here are pretty important if you want all of your squares to be square and not have the outside edges be something less than square. We had two different sizes of boards for the black walnut versus the hickory. The black walnut was actually just a smidgen over ½ inch thick, so pretty thin, about the width, or I'm sorry, about the thickness that we wanted these to be ultimately for the board. And I really just had to clean those up and strip them down into the dimensions that we wanted the strips to be for the board glue up. That was easy. The hickory was a thicker board, and I knew this going in, but it was such a beautiful piece of wood that I fell in love with it, and I wanted to get it home and do what I had to do with it to make it work for this project. It was thick though. It was like an inch and a half, a little over an inch and a half. And so what we had to do with that one is take it over to the bandsaw and resaw that bad boy. So I put a line in the exact center. So these all used to be, doubled up, right? So that was actually about the size of the piece I got. And what we had to do then is just take it over and slice it down the middle on the bandsaw. And then once we did that, we could clean it up and make sure that it was exactly the same width and had nice clean faces using the planer. So pretty common tactic to use when you have a nice piece of wood that is pretty thick and you really don't need it to be that thick, versus just sending that thing through the planer 7,000 times and wasting all that wood and throwing it into the chipper. We resawed, we planed, and we got all of our strips to the same width. So you set up your table saw to the width you want your squares to be, and you run all the strips through at once using the same calibration, and that's how you get square. All except the outside ones. Now, this is that nuance I was talking about. The outside pieces you want to be wider. You want it to be wider so that later you can go through and you can cut off the outside to make it exactly 2 1/4. If you don't do that, what's going to happen is, like, let's say we had all these that are 2 1/4 inches, which is what my squares are going to be. If these were all exactly 2 1/4, we glue it all up, we flip them, we make the checker pattern, we glue it up again, and what you'd end up having is a lot of glue and like little tiny, non-flush areas, and you'd have maybe some clamp marks and some scuffs and all that crap on the outside that you just don't want. And so you'd want to go through and clean that up anyway with probably a table saw. We're going to be able to do that, and we're going to be able to feel really good about doing it because we're going to leave a little bit of wiggle room on the outside. So these are about, 2.5, maybe a little over 2.5. And so I've got about, 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch room to play with on the outside. I can cut that off at the end. That's really important. The first chessboard that I didn't think about that. And I glued all these up the same widths. And then I had to basically make a my chessboard ended up having narrower squares around the outside. And it doesn't look too bad, but when you really look at it, you're like, oh yeah, he didn't think that one through. So we have 2 1/4 inch squares. We have 8 of them. I believe that's 18 inches. I'm gonna have to double check that later, but I believe it's 18 inches. So we just need to make sure that this length is over 18 inches, which we've done. So 2 1/4 inches. Why did I do 2 1/4 inch squares? Because I know what you're saying out there is, hey, Northwest Man, a regulation chessboard has 2.5 inch squares. And that is 100% true. The reason we're not doing that is simply because the boards I got had a width too narrow to get to 2.5 inches. I probably could have gone 2 3/8 if I really wanted to, squeeze it in there. But I thought, 2 1/4 makes for nice round numbers later. Nice round numbers later are a little bit harder to screw up. I like the 18 inch width. The 2 1/4 is pretty easy to remember and pretty easy to set up later when I go through and do all the stripping again. It just makes for an easy project. 2 1/4 inch squares, 18 inches total board, width and length ultimately. And that's what I chose to do. Now, what you're going to see here is a big white piece of something. What is this? Well, this is a piece of MDF that's super flat, so it's going to help with the glue up. I want a really flat table to glue this up on. My workbench, as flat as it used to be, has all kinds of gunk and glue and epoxy and ridges and all kinds of crap on it now, which is actually, it's beautiful. I think that's what you want. That's the goal of a workbench, right? But it's not super flat that way. So what you can do is you can just throw a piece of MDF on top, or you can do something like this over on like a cast iron table, which I don't recommend because you could get some glue on there and then you gotta clean it up and stuff. And I try to keep my cast iron tables as spotless as I can, so I don't try to do glue ups on those. But this MDF trick works really well. One thing you do wanna do though with the MDF is put something like freezer paper or something that has like a waxy surface that the glue doesn't stick to as easily. If you can. So what I did is I just, I took some freezer paper, made sure the shiny side was up, threw that on there, and now I've got essentially a non-stick flat area that I can glue this up on. Why does that matter? Because you're clamping this way, right? Well, yeah, you are, but there's a little bit of curve and bow in this stuff, and I really want it to all be as flat as possible so I don't need to plane off as much, and I can have this as thick as I can possibly get it. So in order to do that, I have another smaller piece of MDF that I'm going to put on top. So I'm going to clamp it this way and then clamp it down and leave it overnight. And that should do a pretty good job of keeping this flat. This is essentially serving as like a giant caul that will kind of keep everything flat. Some people have what they call like a veneer press, I think, and that does a really good job of making sure the entire thing is held down. That would be ideal for this, but I have a tiny shop and I don't have the luxury of the space for a veneer press. And I doubt many of you do either, especially if you're watching this. You're not a cabinet maker. You don't want to watch the Northwest Man. Okay, so yeah, we're going to clamp this up here. We're going to push this down, and that's going to be it. One other important thing you are going to want to remember, there's glue on this edge, and this edge. That one, that one, that one. Don't do the middle. And the reason you're not going to do the middle yet is because once we have these two pieces of 4 strips each glued up, we're going to send them back through the planer. It's going to make these beautiful and flush. And then we're going to glue the whole thing together after we do that. That's going to make the sanding way less intense later when we have to get this entire thing flat. Dealing with 1 ridge is not as bad as dealing with 7 ridges.